Jotunheim. Not a kingdom, not a nation, a realm. A land where mountains scraped the sky, where wind didn't blow, it roared, and it never stopped roaring. Snow fell and fell, layer upon layer, century upon century, freezing not just the ground, but time itself, preserving ways older than Midgard, older than names, unchanged and unchallenged. In the midst of the rock and ice, something moved. He was not born. He emerged. He walked like the world he rose from, heavy, cold, and solid. His footsteps compressed the ice and stone beneath his weight. Stone scraped against stone when he shifted his weight. Cliffs answered as he breathed. The echo was deafening. Other giants stepped aside out of fear, because you couldn't stop a glacier. You can only get out of its way or be swept up, crushed, and carved into the landscape itself. He wasn't content to be slow, and what he does about that is going to blow your mind, and eventually it's going to lead to his own demise. Even the largest glacier feels the pull of something other than gravity and destiny. Hrungnir, he felt it, long, in the silence, between his steps, in the endless patience of stone that suddenly tastes like stagnation. The world, it bent before him, and yes, it bent slowly. Time, it was irrelevant here. When you have no recollection of beginning and no fear of an end. But somewhere, deep in the stone heart, a dangerous thought took root. What if he could learn to go faster? What if the mountain could arrive before anyone expected? If Wait could learn speed, he would no longer be bound to Jotunheim's slow dominion. He could cross realms. He could even test himself against the gods who believed thunder was the final word. The question was no longer if such a thing was possible, but what form it would take. The answer, it came on 4 legs. From the ragged edge of the realm, where ice gives way to wind in the stillness of an ancient winter, came a horse born of motion itself, a creature no god could outrun, a force of nature. He did not attempt to tame or break it, but he laid claim to the horse, and the horse embraced Hrungnir like he was his own challenge. Could he still be the fastest creature alive, carrying the weight of 10,000 men? Mountain and motion bound together, weight married with speed, something the world had never seen, and the world took notice. That's when the stranger appeared, a cloaked traveler, one-eyed, smiling. The two had a long exchange. They did not speak of fate or war. They spoke casually of horses. The traveler shared his own special horse, 8 legs, an unbreakable spirit, and faster than anything alive, or so he thought. When Odin first spoke of his speedy horse, that's where the conversation took a turn. Hrungnir took offense, and giants don't know how to disagree in a civil manner. When Hrungnir was done hurling ice and rock in the direction of his friend turned foe, a race was proposed to settle the matter once and for all. Today we're telling the saga of the strongest giant who ever lived. Not a monster, but a force. A story about pride, pressure, and what happens when cold chaos dares to race the gods themselves. Because by the end of this episode, you'll see why Hrungnir didn't just fight Thor. He came closer than anyone ever had to breaking the strongest god in Norse mythology. But before hammers flew, before thunder split the sky, it began with a race. The cloaked traveler stood beside the giant, one hand resting lightly on the reins of his horse. 8 legs shifted beneath him, each hoof striking the ground with quiet confidence. This was no ordinary steed. This was the horse that carried a god between worlds. Never beaten, never caught, whose hooves had crossed realms no giant had ever seen. He looked down from his mount, resting. Gulfaxi, that was the name of his horse. He did not paw the ground. He did not snort or toss his head. He stood perfectly still, breath steaming in the frozen air, muscles coiled like a drawn bowstring. Speed did not excite him. It was simply who he was. "Shall we see?" the stranger said lightly. "Which of our horses is the fastest?" The giant laughed. The sound rolled across Jotunheim like a landslide, echoing from cliff to cliff, erupting in a chorus of avalanches on every range from here to the very edge of the realm. He laughed because the idea of a god losing felt amusing. They set the course across the frozen ground, over the broken stone ridge, past dark ravines where one misstep meant oblivion. There was no wager, but both understood what being measured meant. Not just speed alone, but supremacy. The gods had a way of reminding themselves of their place in the realms by carrying on with occasions just like this. The giant had the thought that maybe ascension to a new level was waiting at the finish line if he won. When they launched forward, the sound was unlike anything Jotunheim had known. 8 hooves struck like thunder chasing itself. 4 hooves answered like the world was cracking open, like what was under the ice might be exposed for the first time since the foundations were laid. The ground shook, the wind screamed, ice shattered beneath them. The gods watched from afar, the giants held their breath. Sleipnir leapt ahead. Gulfaxi was smooth and steady. Sleipnir's lead was cut short in moments, and that's when the gods realized this wouldn't be as easy as they envisioned. When it ended, the stranger on his 8-legged horse never looked back, because the giant and Gulfaxi led the whole way. The impossible had happened. The giant had won. The traveler's response, well, it shocked everyone. It shocked everyone as much as the outcome. He smiled, like he did when the conversation had first begun, only much wider than before. There were no hard feelings now that the race was over. There was only an invitation, and that is where the real story begins. Before we continue with the saga's account, before Hrungnir steps into the hall of the gods and everything truly begins to unravel, we need to pause. Because this story didn't begin on a page. It began in a mind, told by firelight and echoed in the memory of all those who heard. If you want to find the roots of Hrungnir's tale, you'll find them first in the Poetic Edda. Now, if that term sounds new to you, don't worry, it's not that intimidating. An Edda is simply a collection, a gathering of poems, and in this case, the writings that carried the myths of the North. The Poetic Edda isn't a single storybook. It doesn't have a beginning and an end. It's a chorus of voices, mythic poems preserved in manuscript form, but were born centuries earlier. Hrungnir appears in fragments here, echoes of a larger story that listeners would have already known by heart. It is quite possible that what we have today is only a sliver of what was told, or maybe what we have was the foundation of what the North heard, while the details and the backstory were all subject to change. You can read this tale in the Prose Edda as well, written in the early 1200s by Snorri Sturluson. Snorri wasn't inventing these myths, he was preserving them, recording them, writing them down potentially for the first time. Snorri's account contains the cleanest, clearest, most complete account of Hrungnir's duel with Thor. But here's the key thing to understand. These stories, they were likely told for centuries, before anyone had any idea of writing them down. Passed on from memory, from skald to child, told around hearth, told on the deck of a ship. Iceland preserved them after conversion, not because they were harmless, but because they were meaningful. And they captured the essence of the Viking Age culture and storytelling. Some parts are poetic, some parts are narrative, some are meant to be felt, and some are meant to be remembered. Together, they always taught something vital, like our story. That strength alone isn't enough. That ability without wisdom is dangerous. And I wonder what it was like the first time this story was told. When would it have been told? When was that exactly? It is impossible to tell for sure, but it likely echoes back a time before the Viking Age, and quite possibly began with the first settlers of Scandinavia, mixing old stories with new ones, colder ones. This is consistent with how oral societies functioned and their stories, how they evolved. As settings changed, as details shifted, scenes expanded, the Norse didn't expect an exact retelling. They expected faithful meaning. Oral societies didn't archive history in ink. They carried it in people. And every retelling was the act of stewardship, keeping the story alive, making it relevant, and keeping people connected to their roots. As cold as Jotunheim is, the saga, it was never meant to be frozen in time. It was meant to move and to warm the hearts of the listeners. So let's return to the saga. But know this, when we do, we are now entering Asgard. Because after Hrungnir's victory, the defeated Odin didn't respond to the loss with anger or disappointment, but with hospitality, inviting the giant to Asgard as a guest. But don't think for a moment the story ends there. No. The hardest part is still ahead. Asgard opened its gates to a guest who did not belong. Gold and timber rose around him. Halls built by order and oath, not randomness and the weight of rocks and ice and unrelenting wind. The air in Asgard was warm, and it rang with laughter, though the tone changed slightly as Hrungnir crossed into Asgard for the first time. The giant was escorted to the hall, where Odin and others greeted him to a magnificent feast. Odin welcomed him with the raising of a cup, which was significant for the Asgardian because that single gesture bound every god present by the oldest law of all, uncompromising hospitality. Hrungnir, he didn't bow. He entered as the victor, stone shoulders brushing carved pillars, his shadow swallowing torchlight. Laughter was on edge. The rules held, and the mead flowed. And beneath the shining roof of the gods, something darker than the giant's shadow waited. Like an endless river flowing into every horn, Hrungnir drank, and he drank as if the river was meant to be emptied. But with each horn raised, the tension of the moment was loosened. But so was his tongue. Words began to spark from his lips. With a wide grin, his voice rolled across the table and benches like a waterfall, loud and mighty. His laughter as he spoke and his boasting echoed from pillar to pillar. He mocked the gods openly, speaking of Asgard if it was a fragile thing, wood and gold stacked too neatly to last. "There's no permanence here," he said. Then he continued. He could tear this tiny little city down stone by stone, and that Valhalla would burn as easily as a dry pine forest in the middle of Muspelheim. But then the boasting became personal. Odin was singled out as frail enough to fall beneath Hrungnir's weight. But it wasn't until Freyja and Sif were pointed out as a prize, as a trophy, as the spoils of victory to be carried off to Jotunheim as soon as the feast was done. That is when the hall went silent. Hands tightened around cups, eyes began to race towards spears and hammers. But the law of hospitality kept the violence at bay. Even as every instinct screamed to break it, chaos was stirring, and the gods themselves sat bound to their own rules. And the giant was safe beneath this ancient courtesy, something that he had no idea was keeping him alive, and so he grew bolder and bolder with every breath. Hrungnir's presence exposed a major flaw in Asgard's order. Unruly strength with zero restraint now sat under sacred protection, and the gods had themselves to blame. But there was one Asgardian who was absent, who hadn't raised a toast in an oath of guest immunity. So they summoned Thor. He wasn't present for the festivities. Thor, he came. He returned in fury, thunder booming behind him. Hrungnir was driven from Asgard at once. The giant's laughter and boasting turned to curses and threats. Thor proposed a duel to restore order and dignity. The giant agreed. The fight would be settled in Jotunheim, far from the hall and the realm of the gods. Hrungnir prepared for the fight. He fashioned a shield from solid stone and armed himself with a blade of a rock, built to meet Thor's hammer head-on. This massive shield and blade would be formidable, and Thor's hammer would have a hard time making contact with the giant. Hrungnir even made a living decoy to fight alongside of him. But the moment finally came, and that fragile companion crumbled, and the fight was back to one-on-one. Thor came in like the storm itself. No warning, no hesitation. The sky split open above him, and he charged. Lightning connected with Thor's hammer. Thunder exploded all around him. Each step he took shook the ground. Hrungnir did not move. He planted his feet firm. It was hard to tell where the earth stopped and his stance began. This shield, it rose as broad and high as the face of a cliff. His stone weapon came up slow and deliberate, a slab of rock honed not like a knife's edge. This was anything but smooth, but for impact, for lethal impact. He didn't move, he waited, much like mountains always do. Thor reached back and hurled his hammer through the air with precision, aimed looking to deal the first and final blow, but the giant launched his sword at Thor, and the two weapons met mid-air with a sound sharper than thunder and louder too. The shockwave tore through the realm, flattening ancient snowdrifts, splitting stone and hurling fragments of stone into the sky. Hrungnir's blade shattered into a million pieces. Shards screamed in all directions. One struck Thor, sunk into his skull, and pain exploded, blinding Thor for a moment. This kind of wound, this is the kind that a god doesn't forget. And yet, Mjolnir's path, Thor's hammer, it wasn't diverted. The hammer slammed into Hrungnir's head with the full weight of thunder. The giant's head, just above his right eye, took the full momentum of the blow. A crater appeared where the hammer struck, and liquid of some sort began to seep from behind his eye and ran down his cheek. And the stare of Hrungnir was empty, distant, and lifeless. The giant fell forward, his massive body collapsing, crushing the ground. Dust rose, silence followed, and Thor couldn't be seen. Hrungnir lay lifeless like a mountain range of Jotunheim. But even in death, the battle was not over, because Thor was pinned under the weight of this massive body. The strongest of the gods trapped beneath the strongest of giants. Victory, but at what cost? The weight, it didn't move. Thor strained beneath it. Muscles pressed, but nothing happened. Breath was forced from his chest as the stone pressed him deep into the earth. He pushed, called on thunder, but Hrungnir's body did not allow for even his words to escape. No answer came. Even dead, the giant held him and refused to yield. For a long moment, it looked as if Thor's victory would become his grave, buried under a defeated foe. Finally, help arrived. Men pressed against the giant, not knowing what they would find underneath. Together, they lifted the massive corpse just enough for one to pull Thor from the wreckage. The ground groaned again as Hrungnir's body collapsed back in place, returning to the earth like it had always been there, because from this point on, it never moved again. The battle was over, and Thor rose to his feet. But this was not the same Thor that charged into battle to fight a foe like many others. This one changed him. The memory of soul-crushing weight and the stone fragments still lodged in his skull would follow him, haunt him, and even humble him for the rest of his days. And that is why Hrungnir is remembered as the greatest giant of Norse lore, because he came closer than any to killing Thor. Hrungnir's folly wasn't weakness, it was winning. Victory has a way of changing how people see themselves. They move faster than others. They advance while others struggle. They start believing the gap means they're not just ahead, but better. That their horse is faster because they're smarter, stronger, chosen. But here's the truth the saga refuses to soften. No one can outrun the destruction pride brings. Hrungnir could outrun Odin, but he couldn't outrun the consequences of pride. That is where the warning lies. So, be the hero. Be the humble hero. Take pride in your strength, your progress, your hard-fought victories. And being proud of what you've accomplished is different than the pride that says, I have no one to thank but myself. I am better than others. I suppose it's a fine line, and it may be a very easy one to cross. Just don't let your victories convince you that success makes you untouchable, better than others, or blind you to the dangers that wisdom is trying to help you avoid. Thor had limits. Thor needed help, and Thor learned a valuable lesson facing his giant. He was strong enough. He defeated him. But the follow-through, taking the final step out from under the shadow of the falling giant, was the one thing he missed. Find the wisdom in this story and in other stories. You see, the sagas are full of them. Once you begin to search for wisdom, it can be found just about anywhere. So we see that strength without wisdom destroys, and humility keeps you standing. If this story, if it stirred something in you, if it reminded you of the victories that you've earned, the wounds that you still carry, or pride you've had to reckon with, don't let it end here. I ask you, share the episode. Sharing an episode, copying the link, pasting it somewhere, letting other people discover what you have just listened to is the best way to help this podcast grow. You can leave a review, leave a comment. You can even send an email. You can contact us at Viking Legacy and Lore at gmail.com and tell us what you think. Tell us an episode that you'd love to hear. But more than anything, just interacting with the content helps the channel grow, helps the podcast reach new listeners. And I can tell you that we have reached in the first year, the first season, this being early on in season 2, we have reached across the globe. And it is amazing to know that we have listeners in Scandinavia and we have listeners all throughout North America. And that's our second largest audiences in Canada. And so we are grateful for you. We're grateful for all the listeners. So thank you for being a part of this, and thank you for doing your part to help it grow. So until next time, be bold, be strong, and awaken the Viking in you.